Alright, so sorry for the delay getting this video out. Between Total Warhammer 3 and just a complete litany of mechanical issues, this took a long time to get prepped and ready. But anyways, to refresh your memory, we've taken a look at hard drives versus SSDs, how much of a difference RAM makes in terms of both speed and capacity, and how much does CPU clock help versus how much does CPU cores help. That really leaves us with one big hardware component left to look at, and the one most gamers dump their majority of their budget into, the GPU. Much like with RAM and storage solutions, we'll be comparing two actual different pieces of hardware here. The baseline will be my current Vega Frontier Edition, which is liquid cooled with a 240mm radiator. Much like the CPU, this one I've got liquid metal on the block as the thermal interface rather than an actual normal thermal compound. The baseline will be run the exact same way as we configured in our previous test, with base clocks on the CPU with a locked boost clock, and then we will also run overclocked results for the GPUs later on, but that'll be for next time's results. Alright, so what are we comparing with though? Well, as I mentioned, I've got a Vega Frontier as my current GPU, but I've also got my previous two GPUs, being AMD R9 280Xs. So back in the day, I used to run both of these in Crossfire, with both of them being liquid cooled. Now, before you get too excited, they're both going to be running on air this time around, as I've given my younger brother the blocks that I had for them. But that said, I will be redoing the thermal paste on them, and they are going to be run outside the case with PCIe extensions, so thermals will be a non-issue. Today we'll run one at the stock clocks just to get a base feel for the recommended graphics card, and then I've also tracked down a minimum spec GPU to see just how badly it'll perform in Total Warhammer. Tomorrow we'll try overclocking the R9 280X to see how much, if any, that helps, and then we will also set it back to base clocks and then chuck in the second one in Crossfire to see what that does for us. That's right, I have not one, not two, not three, but 4 GPUs being tested across 5 different tests. I really hope you all enjoy this one because it is without a doubt the single biggest, lengthiest test I've put together so far. Anyways, just like in previous videos, if you do want to skip the explanations about how these components actually work on a, instinctual level, timestamps are down in the description as well as in the progress bar, so you can skip ahead to your heart's content. Okay, so we compared hard drives and solid-state drives to being like long-term memory, RAM to being like short-term memory, and CPUs to cerebral cortex activity. So where does that leave the GPU in all this? Well, your initial instinct might be to shout out the visual cortex because, they're both visually based, but that metaphor doesn't actually work for us. GPUs are used to do stuff, in our case, render images. So I would actually say that the cerebellum fits into our metaphor a little bit more succinctly. If you're unfamiliar with the anatomy of the brain like some sort of weirdo, the cerebellum is responsible for motor function. It's the thing that directs your hands, feet, and core to do whatever you need them to do at the time. This distinction is important because we want the GPU to do stuff for the CPU, not just to relay information back to it. So, metaphor time. Imagine you need to draw a painting based on a reference image as fast as you can, but you have to draw it perfectly. You can't just do a really bad job in the name of speed. So, while all the parts of the brain might contribute, really, we're just focusing on two things. How much of that reference image can you remember at any given moment, and how fast can you physically draw it? This basically describes the two components of our GPUs, memory and frequency. In general, GPUs benefit a little from memory and a lot from core frequency. Memory is essentially boiled down into two big factors. How much of it do you have, measured in gigabytes, and how fast can it be referenced, measured in megahertz. There's actually a lot of finer detail here, including things like bus width, memory channels, caching, controller frequency, and a whole crapload more, but you really don't need to know all of that, well, mostly. Just generally know that quicker is generally better. For sizing, more can be better, but typically only when it's needed. What I mean by this is how much stuff does your card need to store in its memory and only to be affected by it. It's like, can it remember this all in one shot? So a higher resolution, assets and textures, and especially larger resolutions of the actual physical display, they will increase the demand on memory sides, but after a certain point, once you've already satiated the GPU, there's no more benefit to more memory size. But the other big factor is the core frequency. How fast can the GPU quite literally calculate out each frame? The faster the GPU can do this, the higher the overall frame rate will be, and the lower the display lag will be. And I'll give you more description about what that is at the end of the video in case you're unfamiliar with it. Okay, so to bring this back to our painting metaphor, step 1, you take a look at your reference image and you try to store as much of that information as possible into memory. This is the exact same metaphor as the GPU getting the data from the CPU and storing it into its own VRAM memory. Step 2, you try to recall the details of the image. This is the memory controller transferring the stored information from the VRAM into the GPU itself to calculate. Step 3, you would draw the image. This is the GPU core actually crunching the data and then sending that signal out to the display. As you can see, the faster we can recall the image, we might speed up a little, and if we can draw quicker, we'll be able to speed up a fairly good amount. Alright, with that explanation down, let's get into testing methodology and the system itself. So as a friendly recap, the system is going to be set at 4.1 GHz from our CPU test because we don't want the GPU waiting on the CPU to provide draw calls to it. I'll explain more about what that is at the end of the video if you're curious. Once again, that GPU is liquid cooled with a 280mm radiator, and the temperatures have definitely climbed here, but they're still within the realms where stability isn't really concerned. Unlike the previous videos, I am no longer on an X470 Gaming Plus, I'm actually on an X570 MSI Gaming Plus, and I will get into a big rant about all the things that went wrong after next week's video. Once again, that board is slotted in with 64GB of Corsair Vengeance RAM. It's clocked to 2933 with fairly decent timings on it. For testing, we're only going to be using the benchmarks here, given that the GPU isn't going to generally impact our normal calculations like turn times and load times at all. We'll test each one of them though, and as a reminder, I have my game set to 1080p with every single possible option maxed out, and I also have the no LOD mod on as well, so that'll be fairly taxing for the GPUs in spite of the resolution. So as a refresher, the base results were from my AMD Vega Frontier Edition card, which is locked at the stock clocks. The card has 16GB of HBM memory, which is massively overkill for 1080p, but it's also pretty good because I use it for workstation tasks myself, such as, well, editing the videos that you're watching, and I do some rendering with it too. So it's really, really good for that kind of stuff. Once again, it's connected to a 240mm radiator, and the block also has liquid metal for its thermal interface. So across all of this cooling, how does it handle the three benchmarks? Pretty good, honestly. I'm sure some folks are going to look at my previous 41.4 frames per second results from the Skaven benchmark and think, ugh, that much cooling and that much card and you couldn't even hit 60 frames per second. But there's a few things I want to point out to that. This is the average. Yeah, I had spikes go well past the 70. I had spikes in the 80s. But the average was 41.4. The no LOD mod in particular means the card is always running the full resolution models for all units, even when they're super, super far away. And it also means the corpses, which are permanent in my settings, do remember, are also always full resolution. For the two new benchmarks, starting with the battle one, we had a high of 57 and a low of 56.9 for an average of 57 with a 57.2 and a 56.9 emitted. Battle was super, super smooth. There was never a point where it looked like it was even going to drop below 50 frames per second. I'm not quite sure why it did so well in the battle benchmark, concerning for most of the cards that I've seen online, it seems like it's supposed to be fairly lined up with the Skaven results. Anyways, moving over to campaign, we had an average of 63.6 with lows of 63.5 and highs of 63.7. We also had a low of 63.4 and a high of 64 frames per second that were each emitted for too slow and too fast respectively. Campaign, you're going to notice across all these tests, is a super, super easy calculation for the GPUs to run. There's not a whole hell of a lot going on there, even with the litany of mods that I have active. Just real quick too, I wanted to add in, I didn't realize before I started doing these results, but when you have additional mods from things like Old versus New or any of Mixu's Legendary Lords and stuff, they actually do make little appearances in the campaign benchmark, which is a little neat touch that I wasn't expecting at all. I thought it was a really cool little thing to see. Anyways, well, let's move down the scales, like all the way down, right down to the very bottom. What I have here is a PowerColor HD6770, the updated version of the HD5770 that Total Warhammer lists as a minimum spec GPU. So how is minimum spec? Literally unplayable, and I emphasize the literally part because in the Battle benchmark and Skaven benchmark, the game actually crashed in many of the runs, and the card was unable to cope with things. When it did work, we are looking at a whopping 2.4 frames per second on the Battle benchmark, 3 frames per second on the Campaign benchmark, and a straight up could not complete the Skaven one. At no point could I actually get it to go all the way through the Skaven test. Now, as I've said, I've got the settings maxed out and the resolution set to 1080p rather than 720p, and you know, I did try lowering the settings to get things to run, but even at minimum settings at 720p and without any mods, it still couldn't even hold 30 frames per second. Dips below 15 frames per second were extremely common. We're going to go on a little bit of a detour here because I think CA really needs to be called out for what they consider minimum spec. This is the second test in a row now where I've done the results of a minimum spec thing that would be on its own considered unacceptably poor, but this is without even combining those two minimums. This actually borders on false advertising to me. Could you technically get Total Warhammer to boot up and running on a low frequency dual core running through an HD6770? Maybe technically, but the game would look absolutely horrible. Like, I'm not exaggerating. If you haven't seen minimum settings on Total Warhammer, do it sometime. I am not exaggerating when I say it kind of looks like you're looking at Total Warhammer, but viewed through a layer of Vaseline. And even then, the frame rate is so incredibly low that it's jarring, And that's assuming it doesn't crash. Any mods would compound this issue further. This is like claiming that a mini ITX PC case could fit a full-size power supply, but doing so means there's no other room for any other component. Is the statement, it can fit a full-size power supply, technically true? Sure, but it's an extremely misleading thing to say, and the end user would have something that borders on useless if they listen to that claim. Like, I'm not trying to pick on Total Warhammer, and I get that no publisher wants to shrink their user base by making the thing seem like it's more demanding than it is, but guys, like, this is just horrible. Really, I hope when Total Warhammer 3 launches, they actually revise what they consider minimum spec, because this is useless to people. Alright, so minimum spec was absolutely brutal, but what if we move up to a card that's fairly close to the recommended spec? Well, I mean, it kind of falls right in the middle of the previous two. The Skaven benchmark had an average of 19.3, with a 19.3 high and a 19.2 low, with runs of 19.3 and 16.5 emitted for 2 good and 2 poor respectively. The battle benchmark performed similarly with 18.9 frames per second, average 19.2 frames per second high and 17.7 frames per second low, so a pretty big spread there, with each of those 19.2s and 17.7s emitted for 2 good and 2 poor. It fared a noticeably bit better in the campaign benchmark, which, as you'd expect, with a 41.7 frame per second average with highs of 41.5 and lows of 40.1 emitted. Some oddities did crop up on this set though. So on the battle and the campaign benchmarks, the 2 first runs of each were noticeably worse than the later 5. And on the campaign benchmark specifically, there was these weird hang-ups where at least once per run, sometimes multiple times, the frame rate would swan dive all the way down to 0 frames per second and then completely back up to full and like within the span of like half a second. And there was seemingly no cause for when it would happen. Full disclosure, I have absolutely zero idea what caused this. Anyways though, taking it all in, what are some conclusions we can draw? Well, let's start with the obvious one. Don't aim for minimum spec. I mean, it's not even like you can find a card that weak anymore anyways, but even the cheapest modern cards from AMD and Nvidia will both blow that previous minimum spec out of the water. But let's open up that statement a little bit more. If you're doing a new build, should you focus on the GPU? Not in this case. Conventional wisdom holds that when you're building a gaming rig, the GPU should be your #1 priority. And in case you're thinking that I'm only saying no in this case because we're launching this video during the great GPU shortage of 2021, no, it's because strategy games in general, much like Total Warhammer, they tend not to benefit as much from a GPU. Sure, you might improve your frame rates a little bit per second in battle, but you have a lot of other concerns to deal with, and concerns that I'd personally argue are far more important for your enjoyment of the game. If you essentially only play strategy games, I'd actually skimp a level on your GPU and take the money that you would have spent and dump it into a faster storage solution or better cooling myself. If you play a mix of game genres, okay, well then sure, make the GPU a priority, but honestly, a mid-tier GPU will be more than enough to enjoy this game at reasonable settings. Why didn't I run an R9 290X for recommended specs, given that that actually is the recommended spec? Well, that's for a super simple reason, because I don't have one, unlike the R9 280X. Do bear in mind, as of the launching of this video, this channel doesn't make me any money, so all the parts that I buy for these videos are just a 100% straight up expense for me. This video cost me a little over $100 to do, just for reference's sake. I didn't skimp on the R9 280X, I mean I cleaned it completely while it was taken apart, like to the point where it looks like a brand new card. I bought a brand new pack of Conductonaut for it to use. This thing was like in tip-top shape. If it helps, the results for a 290X would have been about 20 to 30% higher than the single results that you got there. Why did this video take so long to launch? Because holy crap, the entire universe was conspiring against me. Even if everything went smoothly, this was always going to be my slowest test because there was just so much work to do on every change. GPUs had to be disconnected and reconnected, then the old drivers needed to be purged and then scrubbed, and then the new drivers had to be installed, then of course each card needed all of its tests done, recorded, and graphed, but that was only half of it. Like, I needed a lot of parts to run all these things, and shipping time for my PCIe extenders and Conductonaut were way slower than normal. Then of course the Total Warhammer 3 announcement showed up right in the middle of all this testing, so I had to delay things for that, and then while I was trying to deal with the Total Warhammer 3 announcement, my power supply decided to pack it in, because at this point I guess I just hadn't seen enough roadblocks. But as the final cherry on top, I hadn't realized, but when the PSU went, of course it took the motherboard with it. So I had to do an RMA on that too, but while I was waiting, I thought there's no point keeping you guys waiting for what's going to be about a 2-month delay, so I had to go out and buy another motherboard, which also turned into a massive kerfuffle because X570 is really not meant to be run on Windows 7. Needless to say, this has been the longest, most frustrating test I have ever had to do. I apologize for the crazy long wait, but I sincerely hope it was worth it for all of you. I know it's really annoying when YouTubers beg for likes, but honestly, just this time, if this video helped you in any way, or really if you just enjoy the content, please do consider chucking on a like on the video, if for no other reason than to help heal my shattered psyche. Continuing on, don't PCIe extenders impact performance? Not really, no. Linus Tech Tips, who actually work in the city right next to me and popped into my work the other day, hey Linus, did a test on them and found that there's basically no results from adding in PCIe extenders. They either work perfectly and have zero impact, or they don't work at all. Now, in the interest of disclosure, I didn't check the results with or without them multiple times, though I did check on my own Vega Frontier Edition and I couldn't find anything outside the normal results, so I feel fairly safe in saying, no, there's no performance impact. Continuing on, I've heard that I should avoid VSync. Is that true? In competitive shooters? Absolutely. VSync should be avoided at all costs. In Total Warhammer? Nah, chuck it on and leave it on. Earlier in this video I said faster GPU clocks can reduce display lag, but that's kind of a cheated response. Yes, they can reduce display lag below what the display itself can handle, but how they do it is by refreshing part of the screen in between frames. This leads to a symptom called tearing, where you have part of the screen displaying one frame and part of it displaying the next frame, with a complete perfect tear in between them, hence the name. VSync solves this issue for us by literally holding back the frame until it's been drawn in its entirety, and then sending it to the display all in one shot. This means we automatically increase our display lag by one full refresh cycle, which on a competitive shooter this would be an unacceptable compromise. But in Total Warhammer, fast reflexes mean absolutely nothing, so you might as well just enjoy the prettier visuals from having VSync on. Why does the CPU affect the frame rate if the GPU is the one drawing them? So if you go back to our metaphor from earlier, you had a reference image and you wanted to draw that as fast as possible so you can move on to the next image. Well, that reference image in our GPU's case doesn't come from thin air. The CPU gives it some basic data. You know, there's these things over here, there's a light source over here, there's some HUD elements down here, and then it tells the GPU to figure it out and draw it. The faster a CPU can give this data to a GPU, the more often the GPU can draw it, which in turn increases frame rates. Obviously though, there's a complete limit to this. If the GPU is already drawing as fast as it can, throwing even more draw calls at it won't improve things in any way, shape, or form. It only helps if the GPU was already waiting on the CPU in the first place, which is a common thing known as a CPU bottleneck. So in our test where I had the minimum spec GPU running to a Ryzen at 4.1 GHz, it wouldn't help if I overclocked the CPU even further. That GPU is already fully saturated with draw calls. However, if you go back to the previous results when I had my Vega Frontier Edition paired off to a severely underclocked CPU running on a dual core, then the GPU was capable of doing a lot more work, but instead it was sitting and waiting for the CPU to send it more data, so it was wasting a lot of its time doing nothing. This is why you're generally told to balance your build. A ridiculous GPU hamstrung by a weak CPU is going to be just completely wasted performance, just as having a ludicrous CPU saturating an entry-level GPU isn't going to get you very good performance either. You want them matched as close as is practical for your application. But anyways, that concludes the first half of our GPU changes. Stay tuned for the next episode when we'll take a look at methods of increasing the GPU performance for as little money as possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again next time.